What Ukraine did tonight crossed a line that Minsk and Moscow had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Kiev did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with purpose, and with a level of strategic clarity that left analysts struggling to keep pace. For months now, there had been signals, not from official statements, not from formal intelligence briefings, just signals that Belarus was preparing something that went beyond routine military posturing. The Lukashenko government has been provocative, yes, but it has been consistent in its provocations, predictable even. Its moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a script. Troop rotations near the Ukrainian border, tactical exercises conveniently timed with Russian offensives further east, missile systems repositioned in the dead of night, all of it observable, all of it cataloged. But what set off alarm bells in Kyiv and in NATO's Eastern Command this past week was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor Belarusian military activity know the indicators. The frequency of cross-border radar emissions from forward air defense nodes, the movement of logistics convoys towards staging areas in Gomel Oblast, the communication patterns between Belarusian military command and Russian forward units, and the sudden absence of routine border patrol aircraft from known flight paths. All of that went quiet, not reduced, quiet. And in military intelligence, silence is never reassuring. Silence is preparation. Silence is the inhale before the strike. And whenever Belarus goes quiet, and the way it went quiet this week, it means something is about to get very loud. Early Wednesday morning, Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR, detected what they described as a significant repositioning of Iskander-M ballistic missile systems, including launch-capable units that had not been fully activated in over 14 months. These are not training assets. These are not political props. These are the kinds of weapons that Russia and its client states only bring to full readiness when they are signaling something very specific: an imminent strike, a coercive ultimatum, or a coordinated opening move in a larger offensive operation. Ukrainian analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Belarus was shifting its posture from passive host nation to active participant. And when a state that has spent 2 years sitting on the fence shifts its operational posture without explanation, even by a single degree, NATO pays very close attention. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was briefed before dawn. The U.S. European Command issued an internal elevation of threat assessment, and in Kyiv, the decision was made at the highest levels of Ukraine's defense establishment. This could not be allowed to mature into a launched strike. The intelligence alert issued through NATO's internal communication chain tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior officials briefed after emergency consultations described Belarus's repositioning as deliberately provocative, operationally significant, and perhaps most importantly, time-sensitive in a way that left almost no diplomatic window. Coercion only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, Ukraine's response tonight was among the most precise and operationally sophisticated long-range strikes we have seen since the opening months of the full-scale war. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of the final intelligence confirmation, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated deep strike package targeting Belarusian military infrastructure in and around Minsk. These weren't standard artillery salvos or improvised drone swarms. These were purpose-built long-range precision systems, Ukrainian-developed Neptune variants and modified Storm Shadow platforms, weapons that Ukraine only deploys when it is preparing to send a message that cannot be misread. And tonight, that message was sent. Tonight, multiple Ukrainian and Western sources confirmed that Ukraine launched simultaneous strike operations on at least 7 priority military targets in Belarus, including the Machulishchi Air Base, which had recently been upgraded and expanded for what analysts believe was intended use as a forward staging hub for Russian long-range bombers. Ukraine moved before Minsk could finalize its operational integration with Russian forces. They hit radar stations. They hit fuel and logistics depots near Gomel. They hit communications relay infrastructure that was almost certainly preparing to synchronize Belarusian air defense with the Russian Southern Military District network. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Belarus's emerging offensive capability, the connective tissue that would have made that capability operational. This is what made the NATO intelligence warning so urgent. Belarus's repositioning wasn't symbolic chest thumping. It was actionable preparation for a real-world military role. It represented the kind of enabling move that could have provided Russia with a flanking corridor into northern Ukraine if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't carpet bomb Belarusian cities. They didn't strike civilian infrastructure. They hit command and control nodes. They hit forward enabling military architecture. The distinction matters enormously, Keck, and we will come back to why. And here is where the story becomes even more consequential. Western intelligence officials now believe that Belarus's latest repositioning was not driven solely by Minsk. It was designed by Moscow to test the resolve of Ukraine and its partners following a perceived moment of Western political hesitation. Russia wanted to see whether Ukraine would absorb a provocation from its northern neighbor without retaliating, betting that fear of escalation would paralyze Kiev's decision-making. But instead, the exact opposite happened. Ukraine didn't freeze. They didn't seek permission. They didn't wait for consensus. They launched a response that was so swift and so surgically targeted that even Russian planners, by multiple accounts, were caught off guard by the speed. You don't catch Russian military planners off guard easily, but tonight, Ukraine did. A senior European defense analyst speaking with Reuters under condition of anonymity described Belarus's role as a pressure valve strategy, a way for Moscow to introduce threat without formally committing Russian forces to a new front, testing Western and Ukrainian thresholds without technically crossing a Russian red line. But Ukraine proved tonight that they remain both aware of that strategy and entirely unwilling to be constrained by it. Their strikes were not only strategically sound, they were calibrated so precisely that the targets chosen sent a deliberate message. We see what you are building. We know what it is for, and we will dismantle it before it is ready. That level of targeting precision matters because it signals something deeper than military capability. It signals intelligence dominance. It signals that Ukraine has eyes inside Belarusian military planning at a level that Lukashenko cannot fully account for. That is not a small thing. It means Ukraine is not reacting to events. It means Ukraine is shaping them. As reports continued coming in throughout Wednesday evening, we began to understand the full scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force assets carried out suppression of enemy air defense operations over southern Belarus, forcing a temporary shutdown of at least 3 Belarusian S-400 batteries that had been repositioned in the previous 72 hours. Ukrainian ground-launched precision systems targeted a logistics complex near Brest that had been receiving Russian military cargo shipments in the last 2 weeks, shipments that had not been publicly acknowledged by either Minsk or Moscow. Ukrainian cyber units, operating in coordination with the kinetic strikes, reportedly disrupted Belarusian military communications infrastructure used by Minsk to relay targeting data to Russian forward artillery units. This wasn't just a retaliatory gesture. This wasn't just a warning shot. This was strategic disruption. This was operational deconstruction of a threat before it could mature. And operational coherence, the ability to act across multiple domains simultaneously, is the one thing Russia and its partners have struggled to maintain since the opening failures of the February 2022 invasion. For every capability they have attempted to rebuild or expand, Ukraine has countered with something that resets the clock and forces a rethink. Tonight was another reset. Remember, Russia thought Belarus would remain a passive launch pad, quietly useful, quietly deniable, quietly outside the war's formal boundaries. They thought that keeping Belarus's involvement ambiguous would protect both Minsk and Moscow from the full weight of Ukraine's response. They thought the threat of escalation would keep Kiev from ever making a direct strike on Belarusian soil. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine struck Belarusian military targets with more precision than many Western analysts believed it currently possessed. Belarus declared a state of emergency, revealing just how unprepared Lukashenko's government was for any direct consequence of the role it has been playing. And Russia, which spent months constructing a strategy built on Belarusian deniability, now faces the reality that that strategy has been publicly and decisively dismantled. What makes this moment so volatile and so revealing is that Belarus's activation happened at a time when Alexander Lukashenko is under significant and compounding pressure. Pro-Russian hardliners in his inner circle want deeper military integration with Moscow, full commitment, full risk sharing, full operational merger. Belarusian military professionals want restraint. They understand that direct involvement invites direct consequences, as tonight has demonstrated. Lukashenko's own survival instincts want a deal, a way to appear useful to Putin without paying a price that destabilizes his domestic hold on power. And ordinary Belarusians, hundreds of thousands of whom fled the country after the 2020 crackdown, want an end to the regime that turned their country into a satellite of Russian aggression. Lukashenko is balancing these irreconcilable demands while trying to manage an economy that has been steadily hollowed out by Western sanctions since 2021. And when leaders in that position make sudden, dramatic military moves, they are not doing it from strength. They are doing it because they have been told to. They are doing it from obligation. They are doing it from fear of what happens if they say no to Moscow. Tonight's strikes may be the most consequential thing that has happened to Alexander Lukashenko's political calculus since he survived, with Russian help, the uprising of 2020. NATO's emergency advisory, now formally distributed to all member state defense ministries, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow Belarus to serve as a consequence-free platform for Russian military aggression. Senior NATO officials said plainly that Belarus's actions were incompatible with the security interests of the European continent and inconsistent with the obligations of a sovereign state not to facilitate aggression against a neighboring country. That is careful diplomatic language for, if you keep doing this, the consequences will no longer be theoretical. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless the situation has moved well beyond routine concern. The European Union's foreign policy chief issued a separate statement calling for immediate clarification from Minsk, which is diplomatic language for a demand that Belarus account for what it was doing with Russian weapons on its soil. The United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense confirmed it was reviewing its support commitments to Ukraine in light of the emerging Belarusian threat vector. And the United States National Security Council convened an emergency session, details of which have not yet been publicly disclosed, but which multiple sources describe as focused on whether the strikes tonight represent an escalation threshold requiring a formal NATO response. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian nation in a direct, unflinching televised address late Wednesday night. He said, "Ukraine did not start this threat, but Ukraine will finish it." He said, "Those who position weapons against our people on whatever soil they stand should understand that Ukraine sees them and Ukraine reaches them." And he said, "We do not strike civilians. We do not target innocents. We target the machinery of aggression, wherever it is assembled, wherever it is aimed." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are not lines written for international audiences. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands that the moment his country appears to accept the creation of a northern threat corridor without response, that corridor becomes permanent. Zelensky is not speaking to tonight's headlines. He is speaking to the next decision Lukashenko and Putin will make in the coming days. He is saying, "We will be there before you." Here is what makes the situation even more concerning as the night progresses. Belarus's repositioning was not an isolated development. Along with the Iskander missile reactivation near Minsk, Russian forces in Kursk Oblast significantly increased their drone launch tempo in the final 48 hours, in what analysts now believe was a deliberate attempt to stress Ukraine's air defense coverage ahead of a coordinated multi-vector operation. Russian naval assets in the Baltic Sea conducted unannounced exercises that cut across commercial shipping lanes, a low-grade provocation designed to occupy NATO's northern flank attention. Belarusian state media, operating in close coordination with Russian information operations infrastructure, began seeding narratives about Ukrainian aggression against Belarusian civilian territory, narrative prepositioning that is typically prepared hours before a planned operation begins. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia and its partners move multiple pieces simultaneously across multiple domains, it is never coincidental. It is orchestration. And what Ukraine did tonight was not simply respond to one piece of that orchestration. It reached inside the entire structure and pulled a critical support beam. Western analysts and intelligence officials are now considering several possibilities for what comes next. One is that Russia, rattled by the speed and precision of Ukraine's response, uses tonight as a pretext for a large-scale escalatory strike package against Ukrainian territory, attempting to re-establish deterrence through punishment. Another is that Lukashenko, now facing both the reality of Ukrainian precision reach and the fury of Moscow at the failure of his military platform, attempts to quietly de-escalate, pulling back his forces while privately seeking a message channel to avoid further strikes. A third possibility: The one that is currently worrying Western officials the most is that Russia decides to accelerate its timeline for full Belarusian military integration, formally absorbing Belarusian command structures into Russian operational control and removing even the pretense of Belarusian sovereignty over its own military decisions. That scenario would represent a fundamental change to the threat landscape for Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, all NATO members sharing borders with Belarus. But today, Ukraine took the initiative off the table. They didn't wait for the threat to mature. They didn't wait for consensus to form. They didn't wait for permission. They acted, and in doing so, they forced every other actor to respond to them rather than executing their own timetable. What we are watching tonight is a test of strategic nerve. Russia wants to see whether it can use Belarusian territory as an unpunished extension of its own military power. Ukraine wants to demonstrate that no piece of geography surrounding its borders can be weaponized without cost, regardless of what flag flies above it. NATO wants to prevent a dangerous precedent in which a non-NATO member state is freely used as a launch platform against a partner nation without triggering a coherent alliance response. And Belarus, or rather the people of Belarus, who have never been given a meaningful voice in any of these decisions, want simply to survive a situation their government has created for them without consent. The test tonight is about more than missiles and air bases. It is about whether the rules that have governed European security since 1991 still mean anything. Ukraine's answer, delivered in fire and precision, was unambiguous. Tonight, we have heard from intelligence officials across 3 NATO member states who are now conducting real-time surveillance of Belarusian military movement in the aftermath of Ukraine's strikes. They say Belarusian air defense systems have been placed on maximum readiness alert, a posture they cannot sustain for more than 72 hours without significant strain on their operational capabilities. They say Russian military advisors embedded with Belarusian command structures have been in continuous communication with Moscow since the strikes began, indicating that this is not being managed by Minsk alone. And they say Belarus's decision to formally declare a state of emergency is likely part of a domestic information management strategy intended to frame Ukraine's precision military strikes as an attack on Belarusian civilians, a framing that serves Moscow's narrative architecture, but that is directly contradicted by the evidence on the ground. Ukraine is not panicking. In fact, by every available measure, Ukraine's command and control tonight is operating with greater clarity and confidence than it has in months. Their response, precise, proportionate, and strategically surgical, sent a message to Minsk that the northern flank is not a free zone. And it sent a message to every NATO capital that Ukraine, even under the enormous pressure of a multi-front war, retains the initiative, the capability, and the will to shape the battlefield on its own terms. As this night continues, we expect more details to emerge about the precise scope of the damage inflicted, the full extent of Belarus's emergency declaration, and the nature of Russia's internal deliberations. But what we know right now is that Ukraine's decision to strike was timely and consequential. It disrupted a capability that, left intact, would have fundamentally altered Ukraine's northern threat calculus. It demonstrated to Russia that its strategy of proxy provocation through Belarus carries real operational cost, and it signaled to the broader international community that Ukraine is not waiting to be struck. It is actively dismantling the architecture of the next strike before it can be launched. What happens in the next 72 hours will be decisive. If Lukashenko uses tonight as a reason to fully withdraw from Russia's military orbit, however unlikely, this moment could be remembered as the night that cost Belarus its role as a threat platform and ultimately preserved what little remains of its nominal sovereignty. If Russia escalates in response, Ukraine and its partners have already shown they are not static targets. They are moving, they are watching, and they are ready. And tonight, for the first time in over a year, Minsk appears to be genuinely uncertain of what comes next. The city is under an emergency curfew. State broadcasting has gone to a looped government message. And the Lukashenko government, which has spent 3 years betting that proximity to Moscow would protect it from consequence, is now discovering what Ukraine learned the hard way in February 2022, that geography is not armor, that borrowed power is not real power, and that a country willing to act decisively at great cost in defense of its own survival is not a country that can be outmaneuvered simply by moving weapons across a border. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is undeniably clear. Ukraine struck first, struck precisely, and struck with a message that every capital in Europe heard. The Northern Front is not passive. And the war, as it has been since the very first day, is being defined not by the side with the most territory, but by the side with the most will. We will be here tracking every development as the next phase of this pivotal moment begins to unfold.